Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Miss Charolette Tallent. Many of you know her. She's a former missionary to France, but also she worked with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in New York City and the New Jersey area, and now she's living in Nashville, Tennessee, attending the Donaldson Fellowship, been working here at Vanderbilt University and doing some really good things for the Lord and for many people. So, Miss Charolette, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, well, thank you for the privilege and the opportunity.
Well, Miss
really
Charolette,
appreciate it.
I'm just so appreciative for you coming by, and I'm so glad to learn, or I was so happy when I learned that you knew Al and Jenny Braca. And our listeners may be out there and say, Al Braca, Jenny Braca, I don't know those names. Let me just say, there are names in the Christian faith we need to know. We all know about the heroes of the faith in Hebrews chapter 11, but also we know about names like Jim Elliott and Nate Saint, and we know about Todd Beamer from September 11. And I'm going to say to our listeners, really, the name Al Braca is right in there with those names. And so I want to encourage, I think every believer should know about Al Braca, and I'm just so glad you knew him. And so let's start out before we get into who he was and his life and so forth, Miss Charolette. How did you come to know Al?
Okay, well, I had left France as a missionary. I resigned in 1996. I didn't know what I was going to do. I had one contact in New Jersey and had met a family through this contact, someone who had been attended the University Bible Studies in France. And I went up there just to visit and try to figure out what I was going to do with my life, the rest of my life. And when I arrived, they told me that I had a job offer, that if I wanted to take it, it was mine. And it was to work in the office of the New Jersey, New York City Fellowship of Christian Athletes office. And I interviewed and I accepted the position and had no idea I would ever live in the Northeast.
Wow. So you're living in the Northeast. You're living 1996. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, I think it was. And lots of people, so many people from different backgrounds, different places. You had to have a church to go to and to help you and prepare you to do the ministry you were doing. Where did you go to church, and what were the people like there?
I went to the Four Winds Calvary Chapel Church in the state of New Jersey. There were only two Free Will Baptist churches in the north and in the south. It's a non-denominational church, and I met this wonderful group of followers of Jesus Christ that just welcomed me in. They didn't know who I was. I didn't have an identity to them, and they welcomed me with open arms. And I attended that church, and I soon met the Braca family.
Wow.
Their presence was very evident there, and I met that family, and our friendship grew through the years.
Wow. So you meet the Braca family. You've got Al Braca was a leader in the church, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a deacon.
And so he's a leader, he's a deacon. Did he talk to you much about his work at that point and when you're in the church situation?
Not in the church situation, but his wife did. And when we would have ladies' Bible studies, she would ask that we pray for Al and his working in contact with his co-workers, because it was a very sinister atmosphere. And many times he felt he probably needed to leave. He didn't feel that he was doing much good in reaching the men and women there for Christ, because it was so dark.
You use two words there. One, you say sinister. So they did some things that were kind of bad to Al, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yes. Somehow, in the early days of 1996, they got an IT tech there in the company that started putting on Al's screensaver pornography. And then when it was his birthday, they gave him a very vulgar cake, and he wouldn't participate in it. And he often had to take clients from other countries out to dinner. And one evening he was going with several of his co-workers, and they pulled up in front of I would say it was a nightclub or a gentleman's club. And Al got out of the car and he said, "What is this?" And he said, "We probably shouldn't be taking these clients to something like this." They were from Japan. And Al said, "You may be going in there, but I'm not. I'm going to catch a subway. I'm going home to my Jeannie.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do anything like this that would hurt her."
Absolutely. And so he had thought and talked about trying to go to work somewhere else.
Yes.
How did they come to the conclusion that he would stay there?
Okay. It was right after their daughter's wedding in July 2001, and they decided to take a vacation, and they went to the Bahamas and Jamaica. They attended a small church in one of the towns where they were staying, and there was a lady that was seated next to them, and she was welcoming to them in their fellowship. But then the pastor said, "Now I want you to turn to someone that's seated close to you, and I want you to pray for one another." And this lady, who was older than Al, grabbed his hand and said, "I'm going to pray for you." And she said, "God has impressed upon me, you are carrying a burden. And you are thinking about leaving your job. Don't leave. You are needed there."
Wow.
And so she prayed for Al, that he would be a light and a testimony. This lady did not know him, and he had no knowledge of anything that he was trying to make a decision about. He took it that was a message from God to be steadfast and immovable, and he decided to stay.
Wow. So he goes back, he continues to work there. Even it was still difficult, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it was still very difficult.
And even he shared with his son, like, hey, this is a young man's job, right?
Yes, he said that was a young man's job. They could take all the criticism and everything that he was facing.
And so that was July, that was August, and then everybody knows September 11, 2001 comes along. You're living in New Jersey, working in the New York City area. What was that day like for you?
Well, the day started out really beautiful. I met my friend Peggy at about 5:30 in the morning. We went for a long walk, and as we were walking, we just looked up in the sky, and it was this crystal blue, and it was the prettiest one that we had had all summer. And I said, "This is a 10-plus day." And then she said, "Well, we should have gone to the boardwalk for our walk." And I went home to get ready for the day, and Peggy was getting ready for her day, and I came out of the bathroom from getting ready, and when I heard Peggy over the antique voice boxes that we had, voicemail, and Peggy said, "You've got to come, you've got to come," and she was crying. I picked up the phone, and I said, "What is going on?" She said, "Turn on the TV." And I could see all this smoke around a building. She said, "It's Al's, it's Al's." And I got dressed. I went to Peggy's house as fast as I could, and she and I headed over to be with Jeannie, and we got there about 9:15.
Wow. And so our listeners may know the first plane hit at 8:45. That was World Trade Center Building 1.
Yes.
And when she's saying that as Al, she knows Al's in World Trade Center Building 1.
Yes, he worked on the 104th floor with Cantor Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And Peggy could tell that it was bad. Before I arrived at Peggy's house, she was sitting watching the TV, and I walk in and I hear her sobbing loudly. She said, "I've watched another plane hit the other building." So we knew something was terribly going on. It was not neither of us felt it was by accident or chance.
So you knew, and that's people that remember that day, it's like one thing happened after another.
Yes.
But immediately you knew something was off when the first Trade Center building was hit and then the second. So we're talking about 9:15 or so.
Yes.
And then you find yourself at Al's house. So that had to be a frightening, upsetting time.
It was. Her oldest son, David, said, "Mom, I'm coming home. I'm leaving work. I'm going to stop by and see you." But she didn't know. She had only turned on her TV very early in the morning to see what the weather was going to be like. And then she turned it off, and she had her quiet time. Wow. And so she was waiting for David to come, and Peggy called Jeannie and said, Charlotte and I are out. We're going to come and stop by. And so then we got there, and there were a few people that were there when we arrived.
So you're there, and all during the time you're there, because we know about the Trade Center building collapsing, but it didn't collapse until 1029.
Right.
You're at his house.
Yes.
So we end up hearing after the fact about all the things that were happening in World Trade Center Building 1. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you heard that Al was doing during those 104 minutes or so?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, there had been a large memorial in our county, in Mount Monmouth County in New Jersey. It lost the highest number of people per capita than any other county in the 3 surrounding states. And we were at this memorial service, and this gentleman that I knew through Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Tom Capsini, he came to me and said, where is Jeannie? I need to meet Jeannie. And I said, she's over, and I pointed the direction. And I said, I'll introduce you. He said, you're not going to believe it. One of Al's co-workers from our church called his parents and left a voicemail and said, I'm sorry I gave you so much trouble, and I walked away from God, but I've given my heart back to God, Mom and Dad. This guy, Al Braca, jumped on top of the desk and said, I'm going to heaven. Who else is going to go with me? And he shared about Jesus Christ.
And we've heard at one time it might have been as many as 50 people around.
Yes. And there were actually 4 accounts that finally came to the Braca family as far as the state of Connecticut.
Wow.
There was a lady there in the Connecticut whose cousin lived in our area, and she called her cousin and said, you have a friend named Al Braca, don't you? And she said, yes, I do. And she said, well, my friend's son called them and said he asked Jesus Christ in his heart and life. Now, that's in 2 different states. Mm-hmm. And Tom Cappuccino lived in northern New Jersey, and there they lived in Connecticut. And that was the 2 accounts that I knew of that were clear.
So these reports are coming out. People are making calls. And so it sounds like in those last moments, which is interesting, it's actually when you're at his house.
Yes.
And you all are praying for him.
Yes.
All of these things are happening within the building. People are becoming Christians, starting to follow the Lord.
Yes.
So, wow, what a testimony and what a story, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It is really a story.
And so our listeners may think, well, I don't like my job, or I don't like the way people treat me.
Right.
Imagine, what if he had not been there that day? And what if he had quit? Or what if he had have gone to that gentleman's club or whatever, or not lived out the Lord? There's probably people today that wouldn't be there were it not for his testimony.
I believe that they wouldn't have been there had Al not had that final time to share what he lived before them. And he had shared with many with whom he had counseled.
It's a beautiful story. It's wonderful. But there's a lot of pain associated with it, too. It was really difficult for Miss Jenny, wasn't it?
Yes, it was very, very difficult for her. She and Al, they really, truly were walking examples of how a couple became one. Mm-hmm. They had the same love for Christ. They had the desire that their home be used as a place of shelter and invitation to people within the church and outside of the church. During their children's teenage years, they often had their children's friends there. They witnessed to them. And then they were partners together, not only as husband and wife, but partners in sharing their faith about Jesus Christ.
You can't help but think about Jeremiah 29 a little bit, where it talks about build houses and plant gardens. So Al worked, but also he had his family. He had his sons, his daughter, and he had his wife, and he must have been, what I hear you saying is he was trying to reach people with the gospel, must have been praying and trying to help the people around him.
He was, very much so. He tried to help them, and he would carry their burdens with him. He'd bring it home, and he would tell them, the only person I'm going to share this with is my wife, Jeannie, and she and I will be praying We'll pray. And Al would bring it home, but then he would let it go, and he would give it to the Lord. And he was a very, very busy man, but his intention was to share Jesus Christ.
Wow. So I think there were 700 employees at work that day at Cantor Fitzgerald, and none of them survived, of course. But there was a man, one of those employees, named Al Braca.
Yes.
And what a difference he made, we believe, in those last moments.
Yes.
And what a difference he made in many people's lives for eternity. And so we're thankful for that.
Right, right. If I might say that Al was one of the few bodies that they found totally intact. And when his son and son-in-law took his comb and toothbrush there, they started asking them questions after they filled out the form. Does your dad have a wedding ring that has an engraving in it? And they said yes, and they told him what it was. And they said, your father's body was laying on top of all the rubble, and his body's totally intact. In fact, his clothes are not singed. His skin is not burnt. And he was one of the few that we found like that.
Wow. So really, it's a Daniel 3 kind of thing, wasn't it?
It was.
It's sad he's lost, but it sure was almost a testimony to those NYPD officers, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
That God had preserved his body in some way.
Yes.
Well, I know this is difficult, or was difficult for you to share with us today. It's remembering what that day was like and remembering the pain that his family went through. But I do believe this is a story that needs to be told over and over again, and I think it's a lesson that all of us can learn.
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, thank you, Miss Charlotte. Thank you, first of all, for your service as a missionary for so many years in
You're
France.
welcome. I loved it.
And thank you for trying to reach those students, taking the gospel to them there in the New York City, New Jersey area for all those years, and then for being such a faithful witness right here and right now in the Nashville metropolitan area. Thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you so much.
And we want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today and to take this podcast and hear it. We want to encourage you to share this podcast with people that you think of that would benefit from it. Maybe someone that's discouraged and thinking about quitting. Help them understand that everything we do, it really does matter. It really does make a difference. And it really helps when we work together. We are truly better together. Thank you for joining us today.